Hello everyone, Rabbi Klayman here with Hanukkah video number 2. A question is asked, rabbinic texts, my Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? What is the essence of Hanukkah? If I were to ask you for the essential meaning of Hanukkah, you would probably respond by saying Hanukkah is the story of the miracle of a light which lasted for 8 days. Well, what if I told you that that story, that conclusion, that reason was actually a reason developed much later on in history, and that the original purpose for Hanukkah is somewhat different? Now, don't be disillusioned, because we celebrate Hanukkah today as the miracle of light, and we will eventually come to the first indication of Hanukkah associated with miracle. But what I would like to do in this video and the next one is to share with you the 4 fundamental sources, the 4 commentaries which actually address the meaning and the origins of Hanukkah. I first learned of these sources from a wonderful book written by the great Jewish educator Dr. Ron Wolfson in the book The Art of Jewish Living, Hanukkah. And he offers 4 conclusions, and I would like to share those 4 with brief commentary. But today, I will share the first 2. The very first reference to Hanukkah, to the meaning of Hanukkah, and to the understanding of Hanukkah, actually comes from the first book of the Maccabees. The book of the Maccabees was a post-biblical book which was written following the time that the Jewish Bible was canonized. The first book of Maccabees was written in Hebrew, and it is the account of Hanukkah closest to the actual date of Hanukkah. So it is the first definitive written recording of Hanukkah's meaning. In other words, the closest to the actual event, written years later, but in terms of history, the closest in history to the actual event of Hanukkah. And that becomes important because as time goes on, we know that not only understanding of holidays and celebrations, but our understanding of lots of different things will change and will alter over the course of time. You know the game telephone. We play telephone when you whisper a phrase into someone's ear. And as that phrase is transmitted from person to person, it becomes much more distorted. Well, that often is the case with history. So here is the first ending. It's coming from the first book of Maccabees, again, written in Hebrew and written in the land of Israel. They purified the temple, removed the stones which defiled it. They took unhewed stones and built a new altar on the model of the old one. They rebuilt the sanctuary and restored its interior and courts. They fixed the sacred vessels and menorah. Then early on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, it was rededicated with hymns of thanksgiving. Then Judah, his brothers, and the whole congregation of Israel decreed that the rededication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness at the same time each year. What I assumed, perhaps erroneously, was that everyone has a fundamental understanding of the basic of Hanukkah, that there were a group of people known as the Maccabees. They were fighting a war against a much more imposing army of King Antiochus, the Greek Syrians who had come in and were conquering Israel and had polluted the temple, and Judah and his family, known as the Maccabees, were responsible for overcoming this imposing army, reestablishing the temple as the central Jewish holy place, and that's where Hanukkah began. But if we take a look at this source, what do we find? We find that there was something which took place in the temple. We found that they were responding to an attack on the temple, and they purified the temple. They removed everything that had made it ritually impure. They reestablished it as the central religious institution in Israel. And it says they rebuilt the sanctuary and they restored it. Clearly, there was a great deal of damage that was done and a great deal imposed on Israel in terms of idolatry and idolatrous symbols. So there was a need to clean the temple and to restore it to its proper form. But then what we find here is we have a reference to sacred vessels and a menorah. Nothing else is really said about the menorah, just that the menorah was fixed, whatever that might mean. The phrase, the text is kind of vague. But then we learn about the date of Hanukkah. This text tells us about the establishment of Hanukkah on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, and that there was some kind of rededication, and that rededication was offered with psalms or hymns of thanksgiving. Perhaps that might refer to the Hallel prayer, which is a series of psalms we recite on many Jewish holidays, including Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, and this is another subject, we'll eventually come to this, the year that the Maccabees were engaged in this fight with the King Antiochus, there was no opportunity for them to celebrate Sukkot. And Sukkot was a holiday when the Hallel prayer was recited for 8 days. It's very possible that year, since they had to forego Sukkot, when they established Hanukkah with hymns of thanksgiving. Those hymns might have been the Hallel prayer, substituting for the Hallel that was denied on Sukkot. But nevertheless, we learn that there was a rededication, that there was some kind of a formal ritual ceremony, and we learn that the date was the 25th day of Kislev. We also are introduced to Judah and his family, and in a very general, somewhat vague way, they rededicated the altar. And it was established that Hanukkah would be an annual holiday, and it would be observed with joy and with gladness every year at this time. That will correspond to the second blessing we recite on Hanukkah, when we recite the blessings about all the miracles that took place in this season. Every year, Hanukkah was to be a holiday celebrated on the 25th day of Kislev. But what's missing? There is no reference to specifics of the oil, certainly not to 8 days of oil, and there is absolutely no reference to a miracle. It is omitted here. Nothing at all about the miracle of oil. We have a rededication of a temple, we have fixing the menorah, and we have establishing an annual holiday, but nothing all about a miracle. Where is the miracle? We will have to wait and see. So here now is the second text referring to Hanukkah and the meaning of Hanukkah. This text comes from the second book of the Maccabees. It's interesting, we don't popularize these books much. We don't know too much about them, but what we do know is that the second book of Maccabees was written somewhat later, after the first book was written, but this book was not written in Hebrew, and it was not written in the land of Israel. It was written somewhere outside, and again, not in Hebrew, which tells us that a considerable amount of time had passed from the actual Hanukkah event to this text in the second book of Maccabees. And here is the text. Maccabeus, a very Greek-sounding term, and again, remember that the Maccabees, as much as they were fighting the Hellenistic practices of the Greeks, they embraced some of the Greek Hellenistic customs. So they weren't totally divorced from Hellenism. Maccabeus, with his men, led by God, recovered the temple and the city of Jerusalem. So again, an historical reference to the temple and to recapturing the city of Jerusalem, which had been taken from them. He demolished the altars erected by the heathens a little bit more emphatic about who the adversary was, by the heathens in the public square and their sacred precincts as well. So we know that there was, again, a cleansing and a reestablishing of the temple as it had been in previous days. When they had purified the sanctuary, they constructed another altar. Then, striking fire from flints, they offered the lights and the showbread, which was something which was first introduced in the Torah. So we know that there was some kind of a light, and we know that these lights were offered, but nothing more specific. The sanctuary was purified on the 25th day of Kislev, again a reference to the specific day. This joyous celebration went on for 8 days. So now what we have introduced into this text is the idea of Hanukkah not just being celebrated on the 25th of Kislev, but 8 days. Why was it 8 days? Here is the fascinating reference. I alluded to it before. This joyous celebration went on for 8 days. It was like Sukkot, for they recalled how only a short time before they had kept the festival while living like animals in the mountains. And so they carried lulavim and etrogim, the palm branch and the citron, which was customary on Sukkot. And they chanted hymns to God, who had triumphantly led them to the purification of the temple. Fascinating. Here, not only do we refer to Hanukkah as an 8-day festival, but we have evidence that Hanukkah that year was a belated celebration of Sukkot. We learn a little bit about the actions and the activity, the predicament of the Maccabees. We learn that they were really incapable of observing Sukkot to the fullest because they were living like animals in the mountains. It indicates to us that there might have been an element of guerrilla warfare here. They were not always out in the open, but they had to fight in secrecy. They had to hide. They had to strategize in a very difficult way. But we are told that they were incapable of observing Sukkot that year because they were too busy fighting a war, which, again, is another reminder to us that when our lives are in peril, we place health considerations and we place survival above all else. Fighting for the survival of Israel, for Israel's freedom, took precedence over Sukkot. Bear that in mind when it comes to issues today with COVID. I know a very different set of circumstances, but just bear in mind the ritual is secondary to survival. And we even have clear reference to celebrating Hanukkah for 8 days with the lulav and with the etrog. We do not do that today because my understanding would be that once the temple was restored, Sukkot was also restored, and there was no longer a need to celebrate Hanukkah with lulav and etrog. That was celebrated on Sukkot, but nevertheless, Hanukkah remained an 8-day festival. The text goes on to say that they chanted hymns to God, who had triumphantly led them to the purification of the temple. So we know again there was a ritual associated with Hanukkah, that there were hymns, there were psalms, there were prayers, and we have reference to the purification of a temple. But this is a general purification. Bear that in mind. And finally, the last statement in this text, a measure was passed by the public assembly, so this was a legislative act, that the entire Jewish people should observe these days every year. So not only would Hanukkah be a limited celebration, but it would be a universal one, that there was legislation created to declare Hanukkah as a celebration every single year. So once again, we have a reference to a date, we have a reference to a temple, we have a reference to rituals, and we have a reference to an annual celebration of a holiday. What is missing? Once again, no reference to a miracle. We establish here that Hanukkah became a substitute for Sukkot. We have somewhat of a historical reference to the nature of the Maccabees fighting and how they were reduced to, confined to caves and to having to live under trying circumstances. We have all of that. What we do not have, again, is the miracle of Hanukkah. Where's the miracle? Tune in tomorrow. Again, Chag Orim Sameach, a very happy Festival of Lights.